So here we go, part 3, chapter 16. Who is it? A scientist working around the beginning of 1800. Zoologist, meaning studies animals. Paleontologist, which should be studying ancient life. For example, if you're a paleontologist, you would study dinosaurs, for example. So what was this scientist trying to explain? Trying to explain the following. The fossil record was showing us that there were sometimes abrupt changes in the organisms on Earth. So abrupt changes in the fossil record. What would cause that? The idea came about that some organisms on Earth lived but are no longer alive. The idea of extinction became part of our vocabulary when referring to organisms. Earth's surface had changes going on. For example, what would make it possible for seashells to be found in the dirt in mountaintops or in the rock outcroppings and mountaintops? Didn't make sense. How can you explain this? So he came up with an explanation. His reasoning to help explain these different changes on Earth's surface was that geologic forces, unlike those operating today, were allowing mountaintops to be raised very quickly from the seafloor in a very short period of time, in a matter of thousands of years. He called this phenomena catastrophism. So a catastrophic change on Earth's surface that could raise mountaintops and take things from the seafloor to the tops of mountains in a relatively short period of time. And obviously those sea organisms would no longer live up out of the ocean. This scientist's name was George Cuvier. So one thing to note about Cuvier's idea, his explanation says that geologic forces, unlike those operating today, were at play, were at work. Our underlying assumption when inferring about the past today relies on the assumption that geologic forces, the forces of chemistry and physics and biology all operate today as they did back then. His explanation does not do that. So this guy with some lamb chops growing on the side of his face is famous and very influential. Some say he rocks. If you don't get it, that's okay. Around 1830, he wrote a book called Principles of Geology and developed a theory called the theory of uniformity. This is known as gradualism. In this theory, he was stating that gradual, repetitive geological processes occurring over long spans of time is what is responsible for the Earth that we see today. So when you learn about in earth science weathering of rocks and plate tectonics, those are things that happen very, very slowly, but over enough time can change the shape of the Earth. And so that's what he was suggesting. What's also interesting about his theory is that it held to the initial assumption that we talked about, that the same natural laws that we see today operated the same as they same back then as they do now. So his theory fits with that underlying assumption. The natural laws of nature don't have to change to explain the changes we see on Earth. So he calculated the Earth's changes would require millions of years to occur, which countered the prevailing belief and Cuvier's idea that Earth was just 6,000 years old. So this scientist is Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell had a huge influence on this fellow. Again, with the lamb chops, maybe it was a facial hair influence too, I guess. So this fellow in 1831 embarked on a global 5-year map-making mission around the globe, riding on the HMS Beagle, Her Majesty's ship, I think is what that stands for. And yes, I do have a board game that has the Beagle and follows his voyage. I can bring it in if you want me to. He served as the ship's naturalist on this voyage, and he was wrestling with the question, what can explain how organisms evolve? What's an explanation for how organisms have changed over time? So, influences of the scientist. Lyell's Principles of Geology. He took it as reading material, hot off the press back in the day for the long voyage. He took his own observations and developed his own fossil collection. He was also influenced by another writer of the day, Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus was an economist, but he wrote essays about the human population and noted that increasing population correlated with instances of famine, disease, and war. That's interesting because it ties in with what we learn in ecology about limiting factors and how the more limiting factors there are, the more pressure it puts on the populations to compete in order to survive. And so Malthus was showing this or talking about this in the context of a human population. And the scientist pictured here was thinking about it in context of the natural world. And we were also, or he was also influenced by knowledge that people already had about domestic breeding of livestock and plants, crops, for example, for breeding them for particular traits. And so this was a concept known as artificial selection, where you pick the trait like high buttermilk content for your dairy cows. And so you breed the cattle in your herd that have that trait of high buttermilk in order to try and get that trait to persist or to enhance that trait in the population. So that's artificial selection. So the scientist in question here is Charles Darwin. So how did he answer the big question, how organisms can evolve? Well, his answer to that question is something known as natural selection. So organisms evolve through natural selection, or they can evolve through natural selection. So when we think in terms of scientific concepts, evolution is a pattern seen in the natural world, according to the fossil record, and measurable in population studies today, genetically speaking. So what explains that is natural selection. So natural selection is the theory, or evolution is the principle. or law, this pattern that we see in nature. All right, so who's this bearded guy? His name is Wallace, and you learned about him in biogeography. But I'm going to give you a couple papers that have you questioning his role in natural selection. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of information here about how the idea of natural selection became part of scientific thinking. So Darwin had traveled the world and on this map-making voyage, including stops at the Galapagos Islands, which are famous for his research there. And he'd been sitting on those ideas from that trip for 10 to 15 years. Ideas just noted in his own journals, but not officially published. In 1858, Darwin gets an essay from Alfred Wallace. Alfred Wallace, the father of biogeography, that's what we credit him for now, since Darwin gets all the credit for natural selection. But Alfred Wallace writes an essay, sends it to Darwin, because Wallace had been on his own studies, and his trips took him to the Amazon basin and the Malay archipelago, and he was asking for Darwin's advice. So give me some feedback on this essay. In Wallace's essay, he outlines an argument for evolution by means of, or explained by, natural selection. So he has the same idea as Darwin. Weeks later, the idea of natural selection to explain evolution was presented at the scientific conference. Darwin and Wallace are both credited as authors, although neither one of them was there to present. So they send this paper in and are co-authors. And so the idea comes to the surface of scientific thinking through this conference for the first time. In 1859, Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species, a detailed write-up of evidence that supports his theory of natural selection. So he basically says, this is natural selection, here's how it works, and here's many examples of it happening out in the natural world from his journals and notes and recorded data from his trip. Initially, there was fierce opposition to this idea. Obviously, it didn't fit with the prevailing beliefs of the general population. It took several decades and mounting experimental evidence from budding fields of genetics before natural selection gained widespread acceptance by the scientific community. So, society is reluctant to change its thinking toward new ideas about how the world works. It takes a lot of evidence and discussion about that evidence before acceptance happens. So what is actually involved in natural selection? What are the components we need? Well, they are as follows. Individuals of a population always vary in their heritable traits. So look around the classroom someday and you see a lot of variation in each of our individual morphologies. We also know that populations overproduce. More offspring are produced than can possibly survive with the finite resources, so there's a struggle out there to survive. Fitness is part of natural selection. Now that's different than what you think. Fitness in this case is a measure of survival by reproduction, success rates. It's not the strongest or the fastest, but who produces the most offspring. So that's what fitness is a measure of. Traits that are favored by natural selection are adaptive, and adaptive traits increase chances that individuals in them will survive and reproduce more frequently. So